let's review what we built so far. We refactored the implementation of our login page so that instead of using username and password encoded in the URL, instead it's being sent over a post. Right? So if we pass in username and password, we are posting the username and password and passing it in the body of the URL. We then on the server side, passport.js is parsing the incoming request, right, and using the local strategy to interact with our local database, and we need to notify Passport on whether this user is valid or not. And once we do decide that is a valid user, that user is then available throughout the rest of the application in the request object as a new attribute called user. We also modify the client side so that now the client side, we can protect certain portions of the application by adding this resolve, right? This resolve allowed us to be able to ask the server on whether this user was a valid user and whether we should allow the user to navigate to that portion of the application. It was implemented using going back to the server to check whether this user was actually logged in or not, and then using these promises to control, control finally where is it that we want to navigate if it's unsuccessful, right? If the user was not found, or whether to let the user continue if it was successful. All these resolves, if they are successful and they are actually resolved, the data that comes back from the server, which happens to be the current logged in user, is then bound to to a variable that can then be injected into the controller that is being protected. So in this case, profile, right? It has access to the current user by just asking it by name. So in the controller for the profile, right, we see that we can inject the current user, right, by name. Right? It's the same name right here, and we no longer need to, for instance, parse out the user ID from the parameter. Instead, is part of the resolve. Right? We no longer need to fetch the user from the server, right, because it is already part of the response from the original query. Make sense? Right? And then we can then reuse that same mechanism, right, for the resolve to protect the rest of the portions of the application, such as protecting the websites, protecting the pages, protecting each individual part of the application. We wrote a second resolve that was a little more lenient, like for instance the check current user. Right, check current user is almost identical to the check logged in, but instead of not allowing us through, if the user is not found, right, it lets us through, right, but it makes sure that we don't have an object. There is no user, right? There's no current user, so we provide an empty object as opposed to an actual user from the server. And this is useful, for instance, in the home page. This is useful in the home page so that we can write some logic based on what comes back from the server. Right? We can check to see if indeed there's somebody logged in. If there is somebody logged in, that means that we have an ID. There's an object that has an ID. If there's nobody logged in, then the current user is just an empty object, right? That does not have an ID, right? and based on that fact, we can turn on and off different pieces of the application. In this case, we're turning on and off links, but we can just as well turn on other things, right? Maybe welcome messages, right? Or information that is specific to this particular user. We can turn it on and off. So, for instance, if we know who you are, if you're indeed logged in, we might show, what was the latest activity, right? Your latest pages, your latest widgets, your latest websites that you created, right? Just information that pertain to you specifically, right? But if we don't know who you are, we might provide a more generic homepage, right? Maybe we could show, latest folks that joined, right? So that we can welcome them. Any new articles that anybody just wrote, right? Across all users. Again, we don't know who you are, so we might display generic content, depending on whether somebody's logged in or not. Does that make sense? Right? Here we're using whether there's somebody logged in or not to just turn on and off certain links. But we can certainly, we can certainly make that a little more sophisticated. Okay. All right. So let's add to this mechanism by adding, making it a little more sophisticated. For instance, not only do we want to turn on and off certain links or certain actions, but perhaps we might want to turn on and off depending on the role that you are. If you're logged in, right? Even if you're logged in, I like to be able to control different content depending on your role. All right. So let's do that. Let's work on that next.